Take one.
Okay, I'd like you to begin by just putting us back in the time period. It was 1934 and it was a depression. What do you remember as a 12-year-old at that time about the depression, how it affected you or your family?
Well, I remember very well my father coming home, being very worried, having lost heavily in the Depression, loans that were due, our farm being in danger of being lost that we'd known in the family, and that he was a very worried man.
Did he talk about it at home, or was it just something that you observed?
No, his mood changed, though. You know, you could see he had a heavy burden, and he didn't talk about it much, no. He did talk about the fact that he wanted to do his part to break the Depression. You know, that he was a progressive Republican.
I'm going to stop you for 1 moment and ask you, when you're referring to he in this case, can you refer to him as your father?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so you started to say that your father
My father was what you'd call a progressive, what I would call a progressive Republican in the then current and historically true tradition of the progressive Republicans in California, of Hiram Johnson. Jim Rolfe was the governor after Hiram Johnson, and then he died. My father knew Hoover and had a different view of Hoover than you usually think of now. They think of the Hoover Depression. I remember my father saying that Hoover wanted us to get out and make jobs and break the Depression. And so he did that. He tried to do his best at cost to himself, because things were very tough.
What was your father's occupation, and how did he help to?
Yeah.
What did he do to try to make things
Well, he was an engineer. He had a machine company, and he was in the gravel business, and also ran was interested in all types of heavy machinery, as I said. And of course, in the Depression, that was very tough. They couldn't make the sales.
Do you remember? Did people? Was there any concern, any fear that things were not going to get better? Was there a lack of confidence, or was the feeling that things, you just had to wait it out and things would get better?
I think my dad was ultimately an optimist, so he thought things would get better. At the start, in 1934, I think his view was toward that. As we went on, over the years, of course, it got discouraging, because it went on 35, 36, 37, and then in 38, there was what some people call the Roosevelt recession before we got into World War II. So it was, but in 34, he was definitely still an optimist and thinking we'd break the Depression. He thought then that the depressions and recessions were cyclical, that they're boom and bust. This is the way it'd been going back however far you could think, and each time the country would come up higher than before. So I think the people like my dad thought this is part of the business cycle. He referred to it. In fact, my grandfather euphemistically was referred to having been hit by the cycle once back in 1890, and that meant the business cycle.
Was your family, would you have considered it a middle class?
I remember Dad saying, in the United States there is no upper class. He said, we're middle class, remember that. And no royalty in the United States. And I've seen polls to that effect too. People don't look on themselves, or didn't then look on themselves as upper class.
Now, I know that you said that your family did experience hard times. Was there ever any danger that you felt or they felt of slipping from the middle class into poverty, or was it?
I was just 12 years old. I don't think I ever thought we'd starve to death, I must say. We had this farm, family farm, and I do remember worrying that we'd lose that. In fact, we had a partner that lived up there, because we only went up there in the summers, and it was a working farm. We kids all worked up there and picking pears and walnuts, and that helped us keep it. And he'd had to tell our partner that he couldn't pay him anymore to stay there, so he'd have to either live off the land or leave. So he could have water and vegetables, he could hunt, and he chose to stay there. And he got through it a couple of years, and then Dad could pay him again. So that did worry us. But I don't remember, because I had such confidence in Dad that we'd ever not be able to eat.
Let's put us into the election then of '34. Governor Merriam, Rolfe had died, Governor Merriam was running as a Republican, and I think people, probably like your family, were quite surprised at this socialist turned Democrat. Sinclair was running as a Democrat.
Yeah.
Do you remember what your family, what you read, or what what was discussed about the campaign?
Yes, I do quite vividly that there were cartoons in the paper, caricatures of Sinclair. He was referred to as utopian sink liar. The liar was always emphasized in the cartoons. He had a program, one of those that were going on at that time, which was, I don't remember exactly which one was going on 34, but there was a $30 every Thursday program and a ham and eggs program, and there was a technocracy was coming in, and it seemed very scary to a kid, because I was told that even then there was a wave of people coming into California, and they would be voting for these programs that would maybe bankrupt the state, so that on top of being in a depression, we'd have an insolvent government. I don't know as I thought of those words, but it really, that was what was portrayed. And on the other hand, we all were, as I said, we were progressive Republicans. For Hiram Johnson, the many, many reforms that had gone through. We were worried about Merriam, because coming right after Jimmy Rolfe, of course, Sonny Jim, former mayor of San Francisco, he wore a carnation in his buttonhole and had a jaunty mustache, and he was, I guess they call him now, charismatic. And suddenly Merriam, who succeeded as lieutenant governor on his death, was sort of a dour person. I remember my dad saying, gee, I don't know whether Merriam can make it.
Okay, great. Please stop for a second.
Speed. Okay. Take two.
Okay. What was the concern about Merriam and being not the kind of candidate he was, maybe being too conservative?
Well, he was stiff, sort of dour.
So when you say, instead of using he, if it's possible to use Merriam.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Merriam was, I remember how he looked very clearly, contrasted to Sonny Jim Rolfe with the carnation. He was very dour. He wasn't a dramatic speaker. He was also very conservative, whereas Hiram Johnson and Sonny Jim Rolfe, not quite so much as Johnson, were progressive Republicans, which my dad and mother were.
Was there a fear that the Republicans had been in office for 40 years in California, that actually you could lose in this election?
Oh yes, absolutely. I think politics is change. The pendulum swings. People get tired of the incumbent party. I don't think I knew of those concepts at that time, but I do now, and I'm sure everybody was worried about this. And
do you remember your parents at all talking about that they were concerned that Merriam wouldn't be able to win?
oh yes, they were very worried.
Can you tell me about that?
Yes, they worked. I remember saying we had to get out and work, and
I'm sorry, again, can you say my parents or
My
my
yeah
father?
yeah, my parents, dad and mother, were talking about getting out and working, and they were worried that because Sinclair was radical, very, very radical, and Merriam was more conservative than the progressive Republican governors before, and was sort of a dour-looking person, and there had been an in-migration to California that the electorate would change, and again, I didn't know this when I was a kid, but I know that they were worried that the turnout of the vote, the Democrats would be motivated to get out to vote, and the Republicans wouldn't care because they didn't like Merriam.
Take 3.
What it meant to be a progressive Republican.
This is not from recollection, but from knowledge of the history of the state. Progressive Republican was sort of like a Teddy Roosevelt Republican in California, or La Follette, I guess, in Wisconsin, and the parties and the leaders were, excuse me, yeah, we better cut that. I did. Roosevelt and La Follette and Hiram Johnson brought about real progressive reforms, conservation. In California, Hiram Johnson brought in the referendum initiative, workers' comp. It was called the Workman's Comp then. The Railroad Commission, which was like the Public Utilities Commission. He helped break the power of the Southern Pacific Railroad over the legislature. He broke the power of the political parties, took away the right to endorse. And so they were doing things that set the model for the country of political reform. And my parents were for these things. They were very much for Hiram Johnson.
Was the campaign, the governor's campaign, was it directed against Sinclair, or was it more for Merriam?
Well, of course, I think my dad and mother tried to be for Merriam and tell us good points, but basically, people were scared of Sinclair, as they called him, and the whole thrust was to scare people about him, that he was the danger of the state, and the state could go bankrupt.
Do you remember any other points? I mean, were they afraid that were people afraid his ideas were against the church, against religion?
I don't remember anything like that. I remember the economic impact, that he was for these unproven schemes, these wild schemes that were not just progressive, like the progressive Republicans who believed in this economic system that we had, but they were untried, and everybody would get a big payment. I remember that, and people say, where is it going to be paid from?
And you don't remember anything about that it would be destructive to the family?
No, I don't remember anything like that about the church or the family.
Sinclair had been a socialist. Was that a concern of people at that time?
Yes, I remember that he was called a socialist. From time to time in history, people are called communists, whatever that means. It doesn't, not a Russian communist or a member of the party, but they'd say, yes, he's a socialist, a radical, a communist, using the term sort of loosely.
And then what was the implication for California? Or I mean, even the rest of the country, did people feel that it was, that what happened to California then could be extended nationally, if you want?
I don't remember anything like that. I think our focus was strictly in California, except that.
I'm sorry, let's stop the video. Yeah. Were people afraid of Are people afraid of hobos at that time? Was it like the transients? Is it like it was now, or do you remember anything like that?
Well, to me, a hobo is different. You know, there are people, they call them Knights of the Road, and they are very proud of their community. You know, they work and they have a very colorful life. So I think it was not hobos so much, but the people who would be coming in here and taking advantage of the progressive system and being a tremendous economic drain that wouldn't work. That's the way they were pictured anyway. Of course, they later turned out that some of these migration waves turned out to be very fine citizens and people who were just very unfortunate in the other states. But that was what was portrayed, that these unemployed were going to pour in, and then you'd also have these welfare plans, and that the state would literally go under, right in the middle of the Depression.
And this was kind of the feeling that was when Sinclair was
Yes.
running, that he would draw these people in.
And I think he said that. You know, he actually said that these programs would bring people in.
Okay.
That was my recollection.
Okay, let's talk about the San Francisco General Strike for a moment. What do you recall? Was that something that you remember in terms of reading about it or seeing that? Do you remember streetcars and things being shut down? Do you have a sense of?
No, I don't remember the streetcars being shut down, but I do remember that the city was shut down. The whole city. There was a general strike. There was violence on both sides with Harry Bridges and Sam Cagle, who I later got to know in law school, actually. I think some people were killed, and the employers all got together to form an employers committee to negotiate with the unions, and it was very scary to a young child.
And what was scary about it? Did you feel like things were kind of coming apart, or there's going to be violence in the streets? Or?
It was an unknown. I'd never known anything like this. My dad came home, and his business, which I'd visited, and I always thought, to me anyway, was a model place. Everybody seemed happy and prosperous, was being unionized for the first time somewhere around in there. Maybe it's a little later, but this was the start of it, that they wanted to unionize all the buildings. And it's easy now to look back because the Wagner Act and the right to organize, but at first it was a shock. The unions, employees against employers, and my dad, I remember, was very upset about this. You know, he just had never seen anything like this. Although, as far as I knew, he was, to me anyway, he was a model of a good businessman. In fact, I remember his saying once, he believed that all the employees should have shares of stock in the company. He was working towards that, like an ESOP nowadays.
So they're afraid that things had kind of gotten out of hand? Would that be the way?
Yes, and these were scary things, you know, Sinclair, as they called him, with these unknown plans, uncertain, financially backed, the general strike, people being killed in San Francisco, which is a harmonious city, mostly, although we have had our problems, you know, with, like every city, of different groups fighting for jobs as they came in here. But basically it was to me as a kid, it was a peaceful city, and suddenly we have this scary election and the depression, you might lose the farm, Dad worried, the general strike. You know, it was a very scary time to a tiny little fellow. I wasn't so tiny, actually.
And what did you think was going to happen in the future? Did you have any sense?
Well, in the case of Dad, my mother was from Texas, so the combination of being half Texan and California, and that's a pretty optimistic combination. I think we always were told we'll get through this. You know, we've got a work, and it's a great state, a great country, and we will get through it.
Okay, and was that part of what, again, motivated your parents who maybe didn't like Miriam so much to go out and to
Yes.
work for him because you felt that that would stabilize things?
Well, I think it was not so much pro-Miriam, because they were disappointed in him, and he was, as I recall, it was sort of a stuffed shirt to them, pardon the phrase, and very conservative, and not as innovative as the governors had been before. But I think it was a worry to a kid. It was transmitted to us. I don't think that completely answers your question, did it?
No, but it's fine to answer it the way that you felt at the time.
Could you give me the question once more?
Oh, okay. The question was, did all of this kind of uncertainty and the scariness of the time contribute towards your parents feeling that even though they didn't necessarily like Miriam as a candidate, that they really had, that they have to, that Miriam still would stabilize, as a Republican would come in and kind of bring things back to normal, or I just was wondering, did that?
No, we should change
Okay,
film,
all right.
because we're not in the middle of it.
And tell me as if you didn't tell me before, you know.
Yeah.
That, what were your parents worried about if Sinclair won?
Well, they were worried that there would be an untried.
I'm sorry, can we wait, please? No, let's cut.
Okay, great. Tell me what you remember your parents' concern about what would happen if Sinclair won the election.
Well, my parents were concerned that the plans that he espoused would bankrupt the state. The money wouldn't be worth anything, that the progressive Republican years would be replaced by a completely untried program, that these pensions would be put in, and that they would attract people who are already coming out, attracted to California's wonderful climate already, and that particularly at the time of the Depression, when everything was so tough, we just would go under.
And there really was a fear that the state could go bankrupt.
Yes, it was. I remember, and there were these plans. They talked about $30 every Thursday, ham and eggs, technocracy, all these scary plans that no one were untried and untested, and whereas up till then you had a steady reforms going in California, and the economic base had been pretty steady, except for the Depression, of course.
And then you're saying that as a young kid, that between what you heard and what you read, it felt very scary to you?
Yes, I was scared, yes, because Dad was having trouble. You know, he'd come home looking worried. We'd hear of family friends having trouble, going broke. We were worried whether we could keep the farm. There are a lot of these things I heard about, so you did think about the future, and everybody was just getting by.
Great. And you said that Sinclair was scary to you as well?
Scary, yes. I remember reading in the paper, seeing the utopian sink liar, and they always underlined the liar. And then there were cartoons of people pouring over the Sierra into California. And the combination of that, plus the unsettled times, the Depression, the general strike in San Francisco, produced a pretty scary time around that election.
Okay, great. And again, the one other question I want to ask you is about people, your parents and other people feeling that you really had to get out and support Miriam and the Republicans because they were concerned that Miriam may not be able to win against Sinclair?
That's right. It wasn't, he didn't produce the enthusiasm.
Instead of P, can you say
Yeah.
Miriam?
Miriam didn't produce the enthusiasm that Hiram Johnson had, or Sonny Jim Rolfe, who everybody loved, who was a good governor and a good mayor of San Francisco. He was very conservative, sort of formal, and everybody was...
So let's just start from again, that he was very conservative because of Big Bang.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, you can continue.
Yeah. It was now, yeah. That he, Merriam was very conservative, sort of a stuffy contrast to Sonny Jim Rolfe and the spectacular Hiram Johnson, who'd been governor and was later a senator. So that my dad and mother were very worried that he wouldn't make it. It was an unknown. There seemed to be a lot of support down south. You know, we're up here, of course, in Northern California. We were very worried about what was happening down in the south. There seemed to be a lot of support. Sinclair won the Democratic primary, so he wasn't just some third-party person. He did win the Democratic primary heavily. So it was a big worry, and everybody said, gee, you know, whether you think Merriam is a charismatic person, that was the word used there, I guess, but that was the idea. We've got to get out and work and raise money for him, or, you know, we will be in trouble if we get this scary guy, this socialist, utopian Sinclair, elected.
Great. Good answer.
Good, yeah.
And let me just, one last question, and later in the decade, turn the camera on for a second. I just want to know whether you, why was it a significant case and
Yeah.
what do you remember it being?
Well, I wouldn't remember anything at the time, but I do later, of course.
Okay, what do you remember about it?
At the time, I didn't remember. I wouldn't have remembered that because I would have been maybe 16 or something of that sort. Although I might have known the Supreme Court made this decision, but of course that was the case when where California passed a law. You had to have, I think, $50 on your person to come into the state of California, which was like a interstate vagrancy law. And the United States Supreme Court, in a very short decision, said that one of the privileges and immunities of citizenship in the United States was to move freely between the states. So they threw that out.
Do you remember at all later on in the decade whether there were more was it visible to you that there were more migrants coming in, that there were more homeless people entering the state?
It wasn't anything like after World War II, when 1 million people came in every 3 years, right after the war. But there was some indication. You'd see newspaper stories. There's the Grapes of Wrath, and particularly down around Monterey and Salinas, there were in-migrations.
And was there concern? Again, was it something that your parents or you read that people were, or you read in the newspaper or heard that people were concerned about it? Or was it just accepted that, people keep coming to California?
Sure. No, I don't think there was so much concern. We were very sorry for the people that then and later were in the Dust Bowl. They were unfortunate people. We had a big state, and I don't think people were that much worried about it. It was just when with Sinclair and the pension and the ham and eggs and all that all together, and his scary kind of philosophy. And we were Republicans too, so we thought we had a good series of governors, and that was part of it. But no, I wouldn't say that there was, at that time, any great scare. There were a lot of people coming in from the Dust Bowl. Now when was that?
38, 39.
Yeah. Well, I think that there was some concern, but not to the extent that of the fear that was present in the Upton Sinclair election.
Okay, good. Did people ever get tired of the poverty and that migration? I mean, was there always public sympathy for the situation that people were in the country, or was there a time that you remember at all?
I don't remember too much. I think that particularly in the lettuce fields and down around Monterey, there was real concern there. But I was pretty young at the time. You know,
Okay, this is fine, yeah. Good. Okay.